But let's continue now with the election. Zimbabwe's election was conducted in a climate of fear, the head of the European Union's observer mission has said. At a press conference yesterday, Fabio Massimo Castaldo said there had been acts of violence and intimidation, adding that Wednesday's vote did not meet international standards for transparency. Now, let's get analysis of these and other Zimbabwe-related matters. We are now joined by Thembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow and Director at the Africa-Asia Dialogue. Thembisa, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Of course, you've just heard from our correspondent who is currently in Zimbabwe. We saw, of course, that press briefing by the SABC being disrupted. I mean, what do you make of the current scenes that we are seeing now in the country, particularly the preliminary reports that are coming out, from those observer missions? The one by SADC also very scathing in that, they came out very strongly and harshly against the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, saying that it actually has come really short of not meeting international standards and, of course, African standards in handling these elections.
Well, it was to be expected. I mean, all Zimbabwe elections are often, surrounded by pre-election intimidation and post-election violence. So it was expected, and those two reports from the EU and SADC are quite damning. And we had this morning from the Zimbabweans government reacting very strongly and angrily, particularly on the SADC report. So, even before that, the patriotic bill, which basically, hinders anyone who wants to criticize the government for whatever reason or speak against politics of the government of Zimbabwe, faced a very, harsh sentence should they be found guilty. So that in itself, that passing of that bill for me was laying the playing fields in terms of what was going to be happening moving forward in Zimbabwe, particularly as we were heading towards elections. So it's a very disappointing scenario and times in Zimbabwe. And I think the message hopefully will be sent to South Africa to say that they have to stop going around being as Zimbabweans full soldiers and lobbyists in terms of the sanctions, because South Africa has been one of those countries who's been going around the world speaking on behalf of the Zimbabweans in terms of lifting those sanctions. I don't think Zimbabweans deserve it. I think, of course, it's said that the Zimbabweans, the normal ordinary Zimbabweans, are suffering as a result. But South Africa, I think, should stop participating in such lobbying exercises, because all the time they get a rude awakening, particularly when it comes to the reaction of the Zimbabwean government towards democratic principles.
And let's just talk about that, holding those to account. I mean, how difficult would it be now for SADC, particularly SADC, as we relate to these observer missions, to declare these elections free and fair, particularly since they have released their preliminary results? I mean, findings, of course, we know that they are yet to release their report, which could come a couple of days later following the results announcement. I mean, how difficult will it be for them to then to declare, these elections free and fair, especially for what Zimbabweans are seeing and from what we are seeing as outsiders?
The situation is untenable, and if SADC does, issue anything contrary to what they've already issued, it risks reputational damage, and all of us and international observers are looking at what SADC is going to do henceforth. Obviously, the Zimbabweans are going to try and push and lobby within SADC to come up with a much more friendly report, because this report is really damning, and I don't think the SADC will actually change its position. We saw Mnangagwa last week with President Chisano, former president of Mozambique, Chisano, in Zimbabwe, and I think he was hoping that Chisano was going to be one of those who was going to endorse this very undemocratic, clumsy, intimidating elections, but unfortunately not. So we hope that the SABC will remain with that report, because all the reports that have coming out of Zimbabwe so far, including the intimidation this morning, and as I've said earlier on, the patriotic bill, which is ridiculous, points towards an election that was not free and fair, but full of intimidation of opposition and attempts of trying to suppress basic freedoms, including the voting freedoms of Zimbabweans.
Of course, Thembisa, the final results have not yet been announced. We know that that is expected sometime today, closer to the evening. But earlier, parliamentary results appear to show, ZANU-PF retaining its rural base and the opposition Triple C capturing the urban vote. In fact, the Triple C has taken 12 parliamentary seats in Bulawayo. Just what do you make of these results that we are getting now?
Well, it's expected. One is expected that ZANU-PF is going to retain power. It's expected that the Triple C was going to maintain its urban vote, as it's always been the case in previous elections. They've been very popular, even though in a different name. But Mr. Chamisa has been very popular within the urban vote. So it's expected that the ZANU-PF was going to maintain power after rigging the electoral processes and intimidating the voters. So there's nothing really new. But what I think we hope to see as South African in particular, a strong opposition from South Africa, issuing some strong condemnation of what's been happening in Zimbabwe and, dropping that diplomatic rhetoric that we've often heard from Derko and Cyril Ramaphosa and calling this exactly what it is. Luckily, we have the SABC report, and hopefully that will help shield South African position in terms of it taking or grabbing the bulls by the horns and criticizing Zimbabwe elections, because others have already done so. But there is a need definitely for the Zimbabweans and for South Africans to criticize, and for the sake of Zimbabweans who are held in hostage by this government continually, who are intimidated continually. And unfortunately, it's South Africa that suffers at the end of the day, because it's Zimbabweans who are seeking better living and protection from this continual harassment, who then come to this country to suffocate our already dying social, cultural infrastructure. So South Africa will have to do something and send a message, clear message, to the Zimbabwean, particularly President Mnangagwa, that it can be business as usual. And South Africa cannot continue lobbying for Zimbabweans' lifting of sanctions when Zimbabwe continues to entrench itself as an undemocratic dictatorship in Southern Africa.
How possible is it going to be, though, for South Africa to take that hard line? We obviously know the relationship between these two countries and South Africa's diplomatic stance over the years, between Zimbabwe. How possible is it, particularly when you're hearing, such utterances by the EU observer mission saying that these elections, as in other elections, are conducted in a climate of fear? We also heard from our correspondent earlier saying that, going into a peaceful election is almost forced to the people of Zimbabwe. They are currently at a breaking point. I mean, what will it take for South Africa to be bold?
Well, I don't expect much from South Africa. They are known for flip-flopping on these matters. They failed to even condemn a simple, obvious violation of basic human rights in Ukraine. So one wonders if they'll be able to do so in Zimbabwe, our neighbor. But I think what South Africa can do to push for a position, a much more stronger position from the government, is the civil society taking a position. Civil society amplifying these atrocities and assisting the people of Zimbabwe by providing them a platform to articulate, particularly those that are in South Africa, to articulate these dissatisfactions. And I think if we have that pressure, you are likely, therefore, to have the South African government uttering a much more stronger position in condemnation of what's happening in Zimbabwe. But to expect that South African government and DERCO will, at its own will, and automatically come up with a strong position in condemnation of what happened in Zimbabwe is far-fetched and a very tall order.
Thembisa, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate your analysis on this matter. Thembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow and Director at Africa-Asia Dialogues, of course, talking to us about the Zimbabwe elections, which we are monitoring very closely. We will obviously give you a rolling coverage on this matter.